Hi, and welcome to this video, and it's not the video that I intended to make this week. Initially, I was going to do a benchmarking video where I was going to do 4 or 5 graphics cards and compare them. And generally, my benchmarking has always been pretty lightweight. I just usually go with the defaults and 3D Mark and run a couple of other benches that I always use, like Dungeon Siege and Unreal Tournament. But then I decided, as I started this, that I'm going to do a bit more serious benchmarking from now on, because I want to start making records of the benchmarks of all of my graphics cards so that I can compare them. So at that point, I decided I'll just do 2 cards, which are the ones you see before you here, and that's the GeForce 256 SDR version and the Radeon Rage 128 Pro. But it took so long to bench the 256 once I decided what I was going to do that I decided not to do the Rage 128 Pro, otherwise this video probably wouldn't have been out until next weekend. But I have got a bunch of graphics cards recently that are interesting and probably worth videos on their own. I haven't really looked at any cards specifically in any depth, so basically this video is going to be all about the GeForce 256, and then over the next couple of weeks I'm going to do the Rage 128, I'm going to do the Savage 4 and a Voodoo 3 and a bunch of other cards, but I'll do them individually and then document the benchmarks in each case so we can compare them as we go along. So I was really excited to be able to get one of these. I remember reading about them back in the day when they came out and all the hoo-ha about GPUs and newfangled technology. It was all very exciting. I was really just talking to somebody on Twitter who'd managed to get one in one of these sort of boxes of scrap gold recovery they got on eBay, and he, in that box, was a working 256 with DDR, whereas this one's only got SDR, and that was what made me go and look on eBay, because I have looked before and they don't come up very often, and there it was, and it was £50, which I think is a reasonable price to pay for something like this. Because the term GPU really is, it was a marketing thing, it isn't really a real thing as such. So Nvidia sort of created this concept where they said that it had to have integrated hardware TNL, and they had a few other criteria that they said you needed to be able to call it a GPU, and that was to include things like setup clipping, and the rendering engine also had to be capable of processing a minimum of 10 million polygons a second. It was a short while later when ATI released the first Radeon, which was their first GPU. They wouldn't even call it a GPU, they called it a VPU, because they didn't want to be using Nvidia's terminology, but VPU didn't last very long, and now everything is a GPU. But it really wasn't anything magical that Nvidia invented, because in the sort of wider electronic design world, there was a sort of move towards things called VLSIs, which is a very large scale integrated circuit, which is basically the technology was getting to a point where the semiconductor industry could start cramming more transistors onto their silicon, and that was simply there and ready to use, and Nvidia just happened to be the first people to take advantage of that and cram more stuff onto a single chip. And there was a need for it because one of the biggest ways on a CPU in systems back then was doing all of the rendering and stuff, but now that was done by the graphics card, so everything should go a damn sight faster. And some people thought the 256 stood for 256 megabytes of memory, but alas, no, it was 32 megabytes, which is what my card's got. I'm not sure whether there was a 64 megabyte version or not. All the ones I've seen around are 32, and as I said, mine's SDR. The SDR was the first version, so I'm quite pleased to have that for historical reasons, though I don't think it was out for more than a few months. Looking through magazines, the sort of hit the shops at Christmas 1999 and into early 2000. The SDR version was around for 2 or 3 months and then was very quickly replaced by the DDR version. But the SDR version is such an iconic hard look, somebody even made a Lego version of it. Well, this was put forward as a concept. I think Lego allow sort of Kickstarter concepts, and if enough backers turn up, then they make it as a kit, but I don't think this one ever hit the shops, which is a shame. So I was having a think about how I wanted to do my benchmarking, and this is my plan. So let me know if you think this is nonsense, but what I'm going to do is going to bench in 3D Mark 99. So the reason for 3D Mark 99 is it's a DirectX 6 benchmark. It doesn't support hardware TNL, I don't think, because I don't think DirectX 6 did. So the cards we're going to be benching over the next few weeks are going to be a mix of some with hardware TNL and some without. But this benchmark shouldn't care, and it'll show whether or not having hardware TNL gives you any kind of benefits in code that isn't optimized for it. Then we'll do the same tests again in 3D Mark 2000, because that's a DirectX 7 benchmark, and that should support hardware TNL. So there you should see the benefits of hardware TNL over the cards that don't have it. And then I'm going to run Unreal Tournament benchmark. So I guess that'll just be a sort of basic power test to see how many frames these cards can kick out regardless. I don't think Unreal Tournament cares about hardware TNL, because I think it uses its own TNL engine. So, but it's just a standard bench, gives you an idea of the kind of horsepower the card will have. And that's it basically for the benching. I'm going to do 4 different resolutions in both 16-bit and 32-bit on 3D Mark, and then beyond that, just some general gaming with fraps. I've made a few modifications to the machine that this is running on. For those that haven't seen it, my last video that I did last week, I built a sort of overpowered Pentium 4 system to run Windows 98, and its primary purpose is to test cards and do some Windows 98 gaming. So in summary, this thing is a socket 478 board, and it originally had a 1.7 gig Celeron in it, and I replaced that with a 2.6 gigahertz Northwood Pentium 4. What I didn't realize when I made the last video was that chip that I put in had an 800 megahertz bus speed, and this board has jumpers for the front side bus and only supports 400 and 533. So I've since got a 2.62 gigahertz Pentium 4 Northwood again, but this one's got a 533 megahertz front side bus, so I put that in there. So the other thing I've done is applied the patch that allows Windows 98 to use up to 4 gigabytes of RAM, and we've got 1 gigabyte in this machine. There's a little bit of hacking had to be done on the NVIDIA drivers as well. For some bizarre reason, they allow you to disable VSync for OpenGL, but not for Direct3D, which is a bit bizarre. But there's a patch that you can get online, and once I applied that, that's allowed me to disable VSync in Direct3D, and also gave me a whole bunch of overclocking features as well. So we'll begin the benchmarking with 3D Mark 99. I'm not going to draw any graphs or anything at this point, because it would be kind of pointless, because there's nothing to compare it with, but I'm going to make a record of all of these results, and then when we do the benches of the other cards, we'll be able to create some graphs and see some comparisons. But what we'll do now is just quickly summarize each stage of the benchmark and see how it affected the performance. So the results are in for 3D Mark 99. So the way I did this was I ran it for 4 resolutions in 16-bit and also in 32-bit color. So there's 640 by 480, 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, and 1280 by 1024. So the frame rates were pretty high in the first-person shooter in the race game for everything. So you were in the hundreds in the 640 by 480 sort of range, and then they held up all the way down. So even when you were running at 1280 by 1024 in 16-bit, you were still getting 50 frames a second plus, and even at 1280 by 1024 in 32-bit color, you were kind of just about playable. So you were getting 33, 34 frames a second for the first-person shooter and around 29 for the race game. So that kind of implies that this card will do pretty well on any DirectX 6 game, and this isn't even using its hardware TNL. So yeah, it's quite a nippy card, I guess. So then what I did was exactly the same benches for exactly the same resolution on Unreal Tournament. Unreal Tournament was a bit of an adventure because while I was churning away, I think I was running the 1280 by 1024 test in 32-bit color, and this happened. Yes, that was my PSU. Just died, just disappeared. Blew all of the rails by the looks of it. I think there was only one rail working when I checked it on the tester, so I had to replace the power supply. Some crappy 300 watt thing was already in this case, so I replaced it with a slightly more modern 400 watt one, and that seems fine. So the results for Unreal Tournament were pretty good. So you were getting hundreds of frames a second in 16-bit color, pretty much all the way up to 1024 by 768. So it dropped just below 100, but you're still getting 75 frames a second, even at top resolution 1280 by 1024. And even 32-bit color was fine, so you were pretty much around 100 frames a second for the first two resolutions, up to 800 by 600. Then it dropped quite dramatically down to about 63 for 1024 by 768, and still a totally playable 42 frames a second on 1280 by 1024. So I think that's enough of benchmarks for the moment. So before we look at the 3D Mark 2000 benchmarks, let's try a little bit of a game. So I chose Spurs to Speed 1937, which is a racing game that I remember having back in the day, but never really played. I didn't even know I had it. I got my Need for Speed Porsche 2000 out, and there was this disc in the box. And it's a DirectX 7 game as well, so probably will take advantage of some of the hardware TNL stuff as it came out in sort of late 2000, I think. And by that time, I think everybody was starting to actually develop for the hardware TNL in DirectX 7. So this also gives me a chance to get out my Cytec steering wheel that I bought ages ago. It's a game port steering wheel for using on these old machines for driving games, and I've not even done it yet, and I've owned it for about 3 years, so we'll give that a go as well. So this game runs pretty nicely. I'm running it at 800 by 600, and I've got all the detail turned up. So it runs quite nicely, but it does grind to something of a halt when you're in crowded situations like starts and so on, which you're rarely in those positions because you only really see everybody together at the beginning. But the only other option for resolution on this thing is 5112 by 384, which is... I didn't even bother trying it because, I don't really want to step it down that much. But I think you could probably get away from some of those bad frame rates by just tweaking a little bit of the detail. But yeah, this is an awesome game. It's an unrelenting game. It does not treat you gently. There's no easy difficulty settings or anything on this. So it tries to replicate the sort of dodgy handling of these old cars, and you'll suddenly find yourself just being lurched from one side of the track to the other as you hit a patch of something or other. And yeah, it's a fun game, but very difficult. But I think it does use a lot of the stuff on this card, because the reflections on these, you probably can't see it on the screen so well, but the reflection on these sort of polished metal car bodies is really quite nice, very reflective, and the game looks very nice on this card, I have to say. Yeah, I totally suck at this, but yeah, not bad performance-wise. Sort of 45 frames a second for most of the game when you're out in the open with maybe one or two cars around you, and kind of half of that or less when you're in crowded situations like the start. But to be honest, you don't really notice because it's kind of chaotic and you're not moving very fast. But nice game. I'm going to play some more of this in the coming weeks. We'll have a look at Porsche 2000 in a little while, but first of all, we'll have a quick check-in on how this card performs with 3D Mark 2000. Yeah, 3D Mark 2000 really gave this card more of a workout than 99 did, that's for sure. So you've got the 3D Mark scores, but just looking at the frame rates on the game demos, they were in the 16-bit color, they were pretty okay. So everything was sort of chugging along at 640 by 480. You're getting kind of 60, 70, 50, 70 on 800 by 600. And then you start dropping down to the 30s in 1024 by 768 and 1280 by 1024. You were getting down into the 20s on the helicopter game, which I think is the more demanding of the two that they do there. But once you move into 32-bit color, things descend pretty fast. So 640 by 480, you're kind of 50, 60, 70. And when you get down to 800 by 600, you're into the 30s on the helicopter game. And then when you get up to 1024 by 768 and 32-bit color, you're down into the 20s already. But when you go to 1280 by 1024, you're barely in double figures. So yeah, this probably gives you a better idea of how far you can push the card with the sort of the proper games that have been coded for hardware TNL. So it'd be interesting to see how that works in the real world when I get to do a bit more gaming with it. So that just leaves a bit of Need for Speed Porsche 2000s. And I had this one maxed out on everything, so it's running at 1024 by 768, 32-bit color with everything on high or very high. And you know, I don't know if it's just me, but I thought this game, well, the outside, the world looks fabulous, but the interior of the cars they look more basic than I remember. I had a look at a couple of YouTube videos, they do seem to be like that, but I didn't know if this card perhaps wasn't rendering some things in the car internals, but I don't think so. I think I remember this game with rose-tinted spectacles, and it was probably not quite as nice looking in retrospect. But yeah, it's everything turned on and it runs like a dream. You're getting some very, very good frame rates all the way through this. Even in crowded scenes, it's not like the other one. You're in the 70s and 80s all the time. It's a very, very smooth game to play. Very enjoyable and a damn sight easier than the other one. At least I can stay on the road on this one. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. So yeah, this is going to be the way I'm going to benchmark my other cards. It's probably a bit boring on this one because there's only one card, but when I start doing the next cards, we'll be able to compare them back to this one. And I plan to do a little bit more gaming on this to get a bit more sort of fraps data on a few different games so that we can compare those as well. So I'll probably be back with the Rage 128 Pro next video, and then we'll continue through the Voodoo 3 3000 and the Savage 4 Pro, and that'll be the beginning of a long-running project to try and document all of my cards in this way. So that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching it, and will consider giving me a thumbs up, subscribing, or dissing me in the comments below, whatever you feel like doing. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next video.
3, 2, 1, go!